Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Nathan J. Robinson. Nathan is editor of current affairs and political columnist at The Guardian. His work has appeared pretty much everywhere: New York Times, Washington Post, New Republic, The Nation, many other outlets. He has his JD from Yale Law School and PhD in Sociology and Social Policy from Harvard University. He is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, which is co-authored with the one and only Noam Chomsky. That book is called The Myth of American Idealism, How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World. And that's what we talk about. We talk about his collaboration with Noam Chomsky, what that was like, the myth of American idealism, and what are some of the positive elements of U.S. foreign policy. As one can suspect, the book is pretty critical of U.S. foreign policy. So in the beginning, I wanted to try and, get some of the positive elements, some of the things that are good about the U.S. and the foreign policy that U.S. has. We talk all about U.S. foreign policy, mostly in the 20th century. We talk about what it's been like in the global South, in Latin America, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Israel and Palestine, and China. We talk about the current threats of climate change and nuclear weapons, and what the future of U.S. foreign policy might look like. I had a lot of fun with this conversation. Nathan is a good guy, and he does good work over there at Current Affairs, and it really was a lot of fun to get into all of these ideas and to see where some of the challenges are and maybe how it could be different in the future. So Nathan was great. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at Convergent Dialogues at Substack.com, also on YouTube. So per usual, like, subscribe, share with your friends, tell everyone if you like this. It really means a lot. And now I bring you Nathan J. Robinson. I am here with Nathan J. Robinson. Nathan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I greatly appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Yeah. So this wonderful book that you've written, The Myth of American Idealism, How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World, through Penguin Press, is about to be out. And Noam Chomsky is an up and coming figure, so it's nice of him for you to give him the first authorship on this. Why don't you tell us, how did this pairing came to be? How did you guys kind of get together?
There, actually, because
I'm curious.
So I was very inspired by Noam Chomsky's writings when I was in high school. He kind of one of the key figures who turned me into a lefty. And then I ended up starting a magazine, Current Affairs, when I was in graduate school, and he became one of our early subscribers. He's always been very supportive. If people don't know, Chomsky's has been very accessible to the public, always answered people's emails, but he's also he blurbs a lot of books from little lefty presses, subscribes to a lot of little lefty magazines. So he was a subscriber. And if his issue didn't show up, he would email me personally to say, my issue of Current Affairs has not showed up. Where is it?
Wow.
And so I got talking to him. And I interviewed him a couple of times and, wrote about his work a little bit. And then at a certain point, it occurred to me that a lot of his critiques, I think, are very important and powerful, but he's not always interested in, packaging them and marketing them or, there's, I've always wished there was kind of the Chomsky book that you could just give to people who don't know anything about him, but he goes deep and he goes dense very, very quickly. So I wanted to, I approached him and said, I'm kind of a popular writer, so I take lefty ideas and my job is to make them, I consider us a leftist magazine for non-leftists. So if you don't agree with us, read us and we'll kind of simplify it, introduce you to the ideas. And I said, well, could we do a kind of a digestible summary of the Chomsky position on foreign policy. And so my job with the book, it's all his ideas and this is really Chomsky's critique of U.S. foreign policy, and then my job it was to sort of help him, to sit down with him and go through all of his work over the past 50 years and like find really good ways that he's phrased things and organize it, and so I'm kind of collaborating, but he's the lead author and it's his like ideas.
Okay. So, you're kind of like curating, editing, compiling, like you're doing all of this. How much of it is like your voice in here, though, as well? You're on the authorship as well.
There's some of my voice in there. It's hard to know. When you co-write, it's really interesting co-writing a book with someone because you find particular sentences where you're like, oh, that's a me sentence, or a that's definitely not me sentence, and then there are parts, like most of it, where it just bleeds together and you can't remember who was responsible for what exactly. I actually purged most of the stuff that I was like, oh, this is too me, because I have a very distinctive writing voice, and it's quite different from Chomsky's writing voice. And I tried to get out the parts where I'm like, this is too you. Oftentimes my stuff is like jokey. This stuff is not jokey.
I see. So I know he's quite ill recently. I know he had a stroke a year or two ago, and then there was a crazy rumor earlier this year about that he was no longer with us. How is he? Yeah, how is he?
Well, he's been discharged from the hospital. He had a stroke a year ago. We had fortunately gotten close to having a complete manuscript of this book by that point, but he suffered a very serious stroke and he was hospitalized for a very long time. I don't know much about his status because he hasn't, I haven't spoken to him in a while. But as I understand it, he's still in the slow, but he's 95 years old. So a serious stroke at 95 ultimately is not necessarily something you're expected to fully recover from.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, he's obviously, I know him from all of his nativist stuff, language acquisition device, all the linguist stuff. So that's
okay. You're the other Chomsky.
Yeah, the other Chomsky, right? I know all of his various opinions and beliefs about U.S. foreign policy and stuff as well. But when in grad school, you learn all about, language development. And so I know that's like his early stuff. And you learn about the biological impact of how we understand how language has a lot of similarities kind of, around the world and how people are exposed to it, all that kind of stuff. So,
well, the crazy thing is, of course, he's one of the most cited writers in history. He's up there with like Plato and Marx and Freud, and you realize that he's cited all over the place in every field, right? Because it's in linguistics and philosophy and cognitive science. In politics, in media studies because of manufacturing consent. So I often find myself reading a book and then there'll suddenly be a reference to Chomsky, even if it's not something that I expected him at all to come up in.
That's right. Yeah, he's definitely prolific. So I guess before we get into the book and many of the themes, there's a lot of ground that's covered, so we'll hit the highlights for sure, but maybe just tell us about you, kind of what's your background and what's your current undertaking at this moment. What's your day job? I hear a slight British accent. Is that right?
Yeah, the slight is right because I was born there and I was a child I was a little British child, but I was brought over to Florida when I was quite young. And so, but the accent kind of lingered. My parents' influence on me kind of ensured that I would never be a fully non-British person. I am an American citizen. I'm a dual citizen, but I'm mostly American at this point. I was raised in Florida. As for my work, I am most of the time the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. As I mentioned, I write books on my own sometimes. I began as a lawyer, which I didn't really do for more than a day because I realized I didn't want to do that. I then went to graduate school thinking that maybe I wanted to be an academic, but then I realized that I wanted to write things that people would read. And as you know, in academia, you're often writing things that are not read. They're appreciated by a small circle. And doing political writing, I wanted to try and find a way to do political writing that would build a decent readership and hopefully affect people's views. And so the magazine is, if people haven't seen it, they should check out our print issues because they're designed to try and pull people in who have no interest in reading a lefty magazine, right? So if they wouldn't pick up Jacobin, but our magazine has cartoons and puzzles and games, and I think a lot about how to make some very serious and often dark topics kind of fun and accessible.
Very nice. Yeah, that's very nice. I mean, I've obviously heard of Current Affairs. I've read it. Yes, it's definitely more on the left wing of things. But as you're saying, it's not Jacobin. It's not some of these other places. It's a nice way to get a lot of the kind of, you were saying in the beginning, the synthesis of many of these ideas, if you want, instead of getting into it's quite well done. Okay, so for this book, U.S. foreign policy endangering the world. What is this myth of American exceptionalism? We're so great, or maybe not. How do we have this idea, this kind of patriotism, this healthy nationalism, whatever you want to call it, that different people over the political spectrum will espouse in different ways? But we're also known to have crazy human rights issues, oppression, obviously colonial and imperialism. How do we understand these things? What's the myth of American exceptionalism?
Well, you mentioned patriotism and nationalism, which exist around the world, but in the United States we have this very particular kind of patriotism, which says that not only do we take pride in our country, but we believe that our country has a special role to play in the world. That we have, some people believe that it was handed down from God, who gave us a noble purpose to bring our values around the world. Some people just believe that we are, an enlightened country with values that deserve to be shared. But it's the idea that America has, you said exceptional, that we are unique in a way that gives us a kind of duty to intervene around the world. Now, the book is called, I think there's a different book about critiquing the idea of American exceptionalism. There are a number of books on American exceptionalism, this idea that we are not like any other country. One of the things that Chomsky has always done is go a little further and say not only are we not exceptional, which I think is fairly easy to prove. Even Barack Obama rejected the idea of American exceptionalism. He said, the French believe in French exceptionalism. America's just a country among many others. So it's not just, Chomsky's not just saying that America is a country like others, but also critiquing, the book is about idealism. The idea that our policymakers are motivated by deep, noble principles. And in a lot of the rhetoric that you hear in the United States government and coming out of the media around U.S. wars, what you'll hear constantly is that we make mistakes, but they are idealistic mistakes. The Vietnam War, for instance, was a terrible mistake, right? We were trying because we care about the people of South Vietnam. We tried to save them from communism. It was a bad idea. The war didn't work, but we are an idealistic people. And when we launch foreign policy ventures that go wrong or are catastrophes, we nevertheless did so out of the noblest and purest motives. And what Chomsky has long argued is that rhetoric about idealism and great and beautiful ideals is actually not what is behind U.S. foreign policy for the most part. That our leaders, when they deliberate on policies, actually speak in power concepts, preserving U.S. power, diminishing the power of other countries. And the rhetoric about preserving and spreading democracy, etc., is mostly for public consumption and does not actually explain U.S. foreign policy. In fact, our policies have been distinctly non-idealistic and even atrocious. So that's kind of the core of the critique. It's not just a critique of American exceptionalism, but it's a critique of the idea that our policies and our policymakers are driven by deep moral values, and that those explain what we do around the world.
So two things on that.
Yeah.
Isn't America, so to speak, the United States, the idea, right? It's not a country. It's an idea, right? It's a country that's based on an idea where life, liberty, happiness, pursuit of all these things. You can be anything you want. This is why immigrants come here. All these types of things. That it's an idea, right? It is different than all these countries. Germany's not an idea. France isn't an idea. Italy isn't an idea. The United States is an idea. That's what makes it different from all these other places. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think what you get us to is something that I think is really, really important, critically important in understanding the critique that Chomsky and I make in this book, which is the distinction between the American people and the American state, the American state power and the government. Because when we talk about America, we often, and even casually, it's really hard to discuss foreign policy without making this slippage between the two, where you say, what is American policy towards China? Well, actually, we're talking about the American state's policy towards China. The American people might not know anything about. They might not know a single fact about China. They don't have a policy towards China. And so we can distinguish between the American people being idealistic and believing in a certain idea of freedom, basic equality among people. I think that is quite real. And American policy not embodying that ideal in practice in the way it's made. So we emphasize this in the introduction, that you can't see, this is why Chomsky is often accused of being anti-American, and I think the reason that criticism doesn't work is because he draws and I draw a very strong distinction between the American people, the public, the country, the idea, and the way that the state has exercised power and the use of military force around the world, for which we bear some responsibility because we vote, but which a lot of people are often left in the dark about, so they don't even know anything about it.
It's interesting because I think you could see, I like the distinction. I think you could see, though, where people could become almost conspiratorial. So what's the country really doing? What are they doing around? What are they not telling us?
Yeah.
How do we know all these things are going on, right? And now, I'm not saying that you, the both of you are that way. I'm not that way. But you hear a lot of this stuff, though, where people start to say, well, it's only, people, the elites that are the insiders that are running the world and telling, or U.S. foreign policy are running things. How do we fend against going too far with there's the actuality of things, and there's things that certainly aren't told to the American public all the time, but how do we not go too far with it, I guess?
Well, I mean, I think you stick to the evidence. We've tried to support everything that we've written in this book with copious evidence, right? It has extensive endnotes, and so you say, well, you can't speculate, and you should be careful about Chomsky, for instance, has always rejected like 9/11 conspiracy theories, right? The idea that the Bush administration somehow engineered the 9/11 attacks in order to, or Kennedy assassination conspiracy. You have to go only as far as the evidence will take you. And I think there are some really strong pieces of evidence that are kind of hard to dispute, like the fact that there is a gap between what the American people say they want the American government to do and what the American government actually does. And Dick Cheney, for instance, was once asked, he said, well, most Americans now oppose U.S. policy in Iraq, the U.S. remaining in Iraq. And his reply was, so what? He said, so what? Well, so what? In a democracy, the opinion of you Dick Cheney, are supposed to be the representative of the people. You're there to carry out the people's will. You're not there to carry out what you want and then try and manipulate the American people into supporting it. Which I think we show persuasively in this book is what the Bush administration did around Iraq. I mean, they concealed evidence that cast doubt on their justifications for the war. That's not a conspiracy. I mean, it's a conspiracy in that it was done in private between powerful people, but it's not speculative. There's evidence for it. And so I think you can quite clearly point to a number of, we can point to the Pentagon Papers, which Chomsky was involved in editing and helping to release, right, showed that there was a huge gap between what the United States government knew about the situation in Vietnam and what the public was being told and what the public understood. So there's lots and lots of evidence that shows that, you know, separate from a theory about how elites manipulate people, there is a huge gap. There's an excellent book called The Foreign Policy Disconnect that's about how in foreign policy, in the area of foreign policy, there's just a massive gap between what the government does and what the public says they want the government to do.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. I think that leading with evidence is always very good. Before we get to some of the big kind of pieces, so it was interesting kind of walking through the 20th century essentially of all of the United States misadventures. What would you say, just to kind of sort of, you know, try to be a little bit balanced here? The book is fairly critical of U.S. foreign policy, and there's plenty to be critical of. There's no disagreement from me on there. But what would you say are some positive or well-rounded kind of claims or ideas about U.S. foreign policy in the world? Again, we'll get into all the criticisms, but what would you say are some positive features of U.S. foreign policy?
As I mentioned, the stated ideals are very good. The stated ideals are wonderful, noble aspirations. I mean, the U.S. had a major role in founding the United Nations, in bringing Nazi war criminals to trial, and obviously in preventing the spread of Nazism around the world. We have things to be proud of in our history. We contributed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The fact that we then don't respect those human rights, nevertheless, we accept the standard, and there's something to be praised in that, right? Because not everyone does accept the standard. I mean, there are plenty of places around the world that do not have our traditions of free speech and elections, and we do have those things. We fight for those things, and the American people, when those things have been threatened, have fought to preserve them. We have a very, very noble tradition of protest in this country, where when our government does things that are wrong, Americans don't like it. They have a deep sense of justice. And so even though we are critiquing a number of specific actions that the state has taken, there is no intended criticism of this book of American values, ideals, or the American people.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. I think that many of those ideals are, I think, important, but again, they're also, sometimes they get kind of drowned out or taken for granted in a lot of ways. So the book starts with something I thought was very, very interesting. Something in my neck of the woods. My dad's from Central America and came here because of a horrible civil war in the 80s. And so we know all about Reagan and his ways of meddling of sorts in the 80s, for sure, in Central America. But you talk about in the global South, everything from how we interfered with Guatemala in the 50s, pretty ugly. Obviously with Castro in Cuba in the 60s, Pinochet in Chile in the 70s, Reagan in Central America in the 80s, on and on and on. What, I guess, generally, if we put all these together, I mean, you could spend, hours on each of these, right? But U.S. foreign policy from the 50s, let's say post-World War II, up until probably current day, really, but until the 80s and 90s, in Latin America, has been pretty consistent. We like to use CIA operatives. We like to try and get involved with coups. We like to give arms to certain sides. There's all these things that are going on. What's the general theme in many of these stories? Like how has U.S. foreign policy thought of and treated Latin American countries in the better half of the 20th century?
Well, the basic thrust of it was captured in the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the hemisphere is ours, and so American influence has to be preserved. Threats to that influence have to be countered. And so I think across all of the different cases that you mentioned, there's a public justification, which is that we're trying to stop communism and preserve freedom. That justification collapses when you realize that we're supporting horrendous dictators, right? In Chile, the overthrow of Salvador Allende ended Chilean democracy. Right? There was no democracy. There was no democracy before. There was not a democracy afterwards. So the argument that we're defending freedom and liberty just crumbles. In fact, we go into the Chile case in the book, and Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger were pretty clear about what their thinking was, which was first they feared that Allende was going to demonstrate, who was kind of a democratic socialist, that he was going to be successful, have a successful democratic socialist country that would provide a model to other countries around the world, and then revolutions would break out. And, it's kind of the domino theory, which a lot of people actually believed. The idea that, well, if you have it in one country and a revolution succeeds, you'll have lots of revolutions elsewhere. And also, they didn't like, and they said they didn't like that the country was slipping out of U.S. influence, and that U.S. influence needed to be preserved. We needed a friendly government. We need governments that ally with us, that take orders, that listen to us, and we don't want governments that are defiant. And you've seen in a lot of the different cases that we discussed that governments that defy U.S. desires or orders are those that come under threat. Those that cooperate do not come under threat, and that is the best explainer of what the United States will do, rather than. So we support friendly dictatorships, right? We support Saudi Arabia, even though it's a dictatorship. But we'll oppose governments that are more democratic than that if they are defiant. And so I think that the United States has always wanted friendly governments in Latin America. And so that helps explain the Reagan administration's policy of supporting some really horrendous governments, right? So the Guatemalan government in the 80s carried out a genocide. And had with the full support of the Reagan administration. Yes. So really, really horrendous stuff. But it makes sense when you understand that the United States is trying to preserve its prestige and power.
This is seen, obviously, in Latin America, and we can see that this can happen, because for various reasons, they maybe feel more kind of powerful or a bigger authority in the region. But this goes around the world too. So let's switch to Vietnam. Yeah. A lot of ink has been spilled on Vietnam. I know. Chomsky's been on record in different places talking about Vietnam, and he's which you talk about in the book here. Again, tell us. I mean, from what I can understand, I've talked to many historians and political scientists on Vietnam, and people really did believe the domino theory. I mean, it wasn't just propaganda, right? It wasn't just that was what we sold the public. Like, it was communism is spreading in Asia, into Southeast Asia. We got to have a certain stopping point, and Vietnam is the stopping point. It could have been anywhere probably, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to see it so far away now that people are like, that was it? That was the whole thing of what we believed? But it really was. I mean, what do you make of this domino theory in Asia?
Chomsky has always argued that the domino theory was true, in a certain sense. but not that it was about communism, but that it was more about successful independent nationalism. And once we had committed to defending the government in South Vietnam, we didn't want to admit, we didn't want to fail in Vietnam, because that would be, in fact, the language was consistent. I was just reading what was said in like 1961 by American officials on the ground, saying if we lose in Vietnam, it will be a blow to U.S. prestige, and we can't accept a blow to U.S. prestige. And the same rhetoric was used by Nixon and Kissinger, which is, well, we can't withdraw from Vietnam. We have to have what they call peace with honor, the honor being very important. And that's the idea that we can't be humiliated. We can't suffer a humiliation. Because if we suffer a humiliation here, people will sense that we're weak, and they will take advantage of us all around the world. And so it is the domino theory, and it may in fact be true, because if they said we can't be a paper tiger, because then in the next we have to show that we mean what we say, and so we double down on our commitments. They may have been right in a certain sense, in that it is true that Vietnam, when any other country looked at what happened in Vietnam, the risks of defying the United States become very, very clear. That is to say that the U.S. will, in fact, stick by what we were propping up in South Vietnam, which was a dictatorship. We were propping up a dictatorship. The idea that we were trying to preserve freedom for the Vietnamese people, that's what was a fraud. Because, in fact, the government that we were supporting are the ones that canceled the elections in South Vietnam. So we weren't supporting a free government. But it nevertheless may be true, not that if one domino crumbles, then freedom goes, because, as I say, that's not what we're trying to support, but that U.S. prestige and U.S. power are threatened by any defeat, however minor, wherever in the world it is. I think that also kind of explains why we stayed in Afghanistan so long, the idea, well, we can't admit defeat. We have to maintain our,
That there's too many crazy parallels with Afghanistan, Vietnam. I guess maybe specifically here, I don't think you mentioned it too much in the book, but just if you have any thoughts on it, why do you think McNamara had such an outsized role in Vietnam? And I mean, I think he's still the longest serving Secretary of Defense, comes from Ford Motor Company, and is telling us how to do stuff in foreign policy in Vietnam and in all of Asia, actually, for a variety of presidents. How much does his influence really impact U.S. foreign policy, or was it really just, he was just there and, okay, he had power, but it really wasn't just him, it was other players involved? What do you make of this?
Well, it's interesting that he's the kind of automotive executive who ends up becoming I don't know if there are other cases of that, but he had the exact mindset that fit with the kind of democratic, liberal, technocratic approach of the time. The idea that you can run this war like you would run an auto plant. You are you can be efficient. You look at your charts, you look at your graphs, you look at your diagrams, and you can reduce everything to that. And so he kind of perfectly embodies the technocratic ideal of the time. So why he in particular had outsized influence, you'd have to talk to a presidential historian about that. But it is true that kind of mindset, which was part of our undoing in Vietnam, the idea that you could just try and find the right numbers and the right way to organize this, and you would win this war without having to understand anything about the Vietnamese population, right? Without having to speak Vietnamese. Without having to read Vietnamese history, without having to have a deep understanding of the culture and the people, that you could be a detached bureaucrat and still find a way to win.
It's it's something that he alone is very interesting, and just why so many people listen to him for so long is still baffling to me. So let's tie this with Afghanistan, I guess, a little bit, or not. We can a little bit. We can find some correlations here, but I mean, it does seem. I mean, you had various people. I think in the Clinton administration, they were worried about the Taliban and things like that. But it does seem like it was inevitable that the Taliban and everything after 9/11, like we were going to go there. We were going to go to Afghanistan after 9/11. Like that was going to happen. But it's the fact that we stayed there for 20 years. So you can build on this idea of leaving with honor and not wanting to be seen as losing and things like that. But why did we continue, to stay in Afghanistan through 4 presidents, 20 years, all of these lives lost, civilian and military? It's just such an awful thing that it was so long. And of course, the exit was right, too late, but it was terrible how the exit was done as well.
Right.
I mean, what do you make of this?
Well, first, you say it was inevitable, which I think it might be true in the sense that it was very unlikely that the Bush administration would take a different course. But one of the things that we note in the book that is kind of underappreciated is that there are a number of pretty credible reports suggesting that after 9/11, the Taliban was open to negotiations to turn over Osama bin Laden. And that if that had been pursued, we may have been able to capture Osama bin Laden, put him on trial, dismantle al-Qaeda with the cooperation of the Taliban, who had a very kind of mixed relationship with Osama bin Laden. They weren't, and unfortunately, they were conflated after 9/11. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were conflated in the American mind. They were just talked about as one thing, which is a real shame because ultimately, and when the United States started bombing Afghanistan, the Taliban increased their willingness to negotiate. They really didn't want to be deposed, to be overthrown and driven from power. So and in fact, most of the serious analysts I've read have said that one of the most serious mistakes that was made in Afghanistan was not incorporating the Taliban into the settlement after the war, trying to give them some role. The idea was they had to be crushed, they had to be defeated, they had to be driven out. Now, obviously, like the Taliban are horrendous, but what we have ended up with is complete Taliban rule. So you've ended up in the worst possible place. In fact, it's worse even than it was before we went in by some metrics.
It's a shame.
Now, why did we stay in? Is your question? I think the answer to that is reasonably obvious, which is that no U.S. president wanted to take the political hit from leaving Afghanistan. So, it wasn't considered terribly costly, and it would have been an embarrassing defeat. And this idea that the worst possible thing you can do is to be defeated and to suffer a loss because this hurts American prestige, kept us in this situation where we were propping up a government that was despised, right? Because a lot of the people in this government were warlords, they were corrupt. The excellent book, The Afghanistan Papers, which compiles all of the internal assessments of the Afghanistan war, show that we knew that it was a corrupt and unpopular government that couldn't survive without us continually funneling support to it. But nobody wanted to admit that it had, and we knew that as soon as we pulled that support, the Taliban would be back in power.
Yeah. I mean, I think at the time, we both can remember, 9/11 and then the days afterwards. But I mean, it's one of those things where I think most people were kind of supportive of like, yeah, we have to, go get the guys that got us, and made the attack. And okay, of course, someone wanted 20 years. But Iraq, it's a different story. I mean, totally different. I mean, it is what a crime. I mean, and it's interesting because with Afghanistan, it was, let's just bomb Tora Bora right away. Boom, let's go. With Iraq, it was this whole thing. We go to Congress, sending Colin Powell there, the whole nine. Why, putting this idea of, WMDs and, the whole thing with Saddam and then selling it as trying to promote democracy around the world. I mean, is Iraq one of the worst decisions U.S. foreign policy has ever made. It has to be.
Yeah, probably. I mean, the article that Chomsky and I originally did about this, which has been adapted into the book chapter, is called "The Worst Crime of the 21st Century." Putin's invasion of Ukraine might approach that now. I'm not sure. I don't think we know the exact death toll. But in terms of the human consequences, I mean, they don't even know. We still have not even a range, I don't think, within 100,000 of the deaths that occurred as a result of the U.S. war in Iraq. I mean, the death ranges for the war are like between 100,000 and a million. I mean, it's so imprecise because the country was wrecked so thoroughly that it was impossible to actually figure out how much damage had been done. Because there's no infrastructure to collect the statistics. But we do know that the war, I mean, we can conclude that the war was a real catastrophe. It unleashed, ultimately led to the rise of ISIS, the most ruthless and horrifying entity perhaps in the world. It's not, obviously needs to be said that none of this is to romanticize the Saddam Hussein era.
Sure.
But the war was both ill-conceived at the outset and spectacularly mismanaged by the people who were in charge of it, who knew nothing of Iraq, similar to Vietnam. They knew nothing of Iraq. They didn't care to learn much about Iraq. They didn't care to let Iraqis lead. And yeah, as you say, I mean, bringing it to Congress obviously generated, first off, bipartisan complicity, because a number of Democrats, including Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, ended up supporting that war. They're now kind of held accountable for it. I mean, from a tactical perspective, the Bush administration was sensible to get a number of Democrats to sign off on it as well.
It's interesting how much that we keep learning about that, and we're going to keep learning about that, and it only gets worse with time. I mean, it was awful when it happened, and as you know, we all knew people that went over there and things like that. But even still, it continues to be horrific as you know, all the carnage there. The other big piece here, which is a tough topic, of course, is the current Israel-Gaza conflict. Now, I don't know how much you want to talk on this. You do have a note in the book in the beginning of the chapter on Israel, Palestine, and the U.S., saying that you had written this chapter you finalized it in early 2023 before October 7th and the subsequent conflict that's been going on there now. I guess what has, I guess, changed in the opinions from the chapter and Chomsky? I mean, I think Chomsky is a pretty big anti-Zionist, if I'm not mistaken. And but does it do anything different, or is it just kind of confirm the beliefs that were already there about U.S. involvement with Israel and Palestine, or what's the big thing here?
Yeah. So the context of this is that, as we mentioned, Professor Chomsky had a stroke about a year ago, and before October 7th. And we had finished up the chapter on Israel-Palestine, which ended, I think the last things in it that are discussed were in 2022. And so obviously after his medical event, he was not able to contribute further writing, so we couldn't bring the chapter up to date. So I wrote, the way I'd kind of resolved this was to write a little post-script that is about things that happened about October 7th and after. But I actually ended up thinking that it's kind of interesting now, in the light of what happened on October 7th, to look back at the chapter as we wrote it, as things stood right before then, because we basically go up to then. So you see all of the context. So the chapter now, as it's written, is entirely the context for the present war. And the argument there, I think the central argument, is that the United States role has not been a constructive one. That through our support for even though we say we don't support, but our ultimate support for Israel's occupation of Palestine has contributed to the prolonging of the conflict, and that if the United States had instead pressured Israel to accept the legitimacy of a Palestinian state, the conflict it's hard to know counterfactuals, but would have been less likely to devolve in the way that it has. I mean, what was being argued by Chomsky and what is argued in this chapter is that the U.S. role has guaranteed the prolongation of conflict.
Why do you think this conflict is so hot and sensitive, and it's very hard to talk about it? How do we thread the needle here in talking about this? If people want to take a side, or if there's no kind of middle way here. It's a very, very, very sensitive topic. How do we feel that, hey, look, at the end of the day, people's lives are being taken, whatever it put behind it, whatever ideology. And why are we getting all these foreign, state actors, in play, that are sort of kind of, either playing both sides or taking a side? I mean, why is this so contentious?
Well, one reason why the conflict is so contentious is that each side in the conflict has a quite compelling story to tell. If the Palestinian story is the story of dispossession and occupation, and that story is grounded in fact, in that Palestine is under occupation, in that the military occupation has been brutal. The land that once was Palestine, a large portion of that was turned into Israel, with Arab villages being given new names, given Hebrew names. Arabs were expelled from their homes and their towns and not allowed to come back. They have a very compelling narrative that a serious injustice was done to them. On the Israeli side, there is also a compelling story, which is the story of a people who have been persecuted for all of their recorded history, who have been stateless, who have been denied self-determination, and whose oppression ultimately culminated in the Holocaust. I mean, in the systematic extermination of Europe's Jewish population. I mean, just the worst evil in history was done to the Jews. And so you would see why the idea of returning to their historic homeland, of establishing a state there, and protecting it by any means necessary, why that would be an incredibly compelling story, and why, you could see, I mean, I talk to people who are Zionist or pro-Israeli, and they say on all sides we're surrounded by enemies. We have this tiny little state with only a few million people in it. It's a little blip on the map, and it's what we have, and we have to preserve and protect it as best we can. And so they see themselves as in an existential war, and frankly, given the context of the Holocaust, you could see why they would see themselves as being in an existential war for their survival. So you have two narratives in this one speck of land, and both of them are in their way very compelling.
Let me ask something. We can use it on this example, but then for a larger example as well. U.S. involvement in Israel since 1940, was it 47, 48? I can't remember when it was. Has been virtually unchanged, right? Like presidents come, presidents go. You can have Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, but in terms of U.S. foreign policy and the involvement with Israel, it stays relatively the same. And on the Israeli side too, regardless of who's the prime minister there. I mean, is there really anything different in U.S. foreign policy with Israel over the past 80 years?
Not really. I mean, there are some changes. There are presidents that are slightly more willing or less willing to put pressure on on Israel. But for the most part, the United States has been fairly committed to supporting Israel relatively unconditionally. And we've changed, there have been changes in the rhetoric. So, for example, the Trump administration was much more sympathetic to Israel's takeover of Palestinian lands than the Obama administration was. But ultimately, both the Trump and Obama administration would protect Israel at the United Nations, for instance, by voting against UN resolutions calling for the immediate imposition of a two-state settlement and the withdrawing of Israel from the occupied territories. So, there has been, and in fact, one of the arguments of the book is that U.S. foreign policy has mostly been consistent. In domestic policy, there are changes that are fairly significant from president to president. I mean, and obviously there are instances like the Iraq War that are quite extreme, where it's unlikely that Al Gore would have waged the Iraq War. That was a Bush administration neoconservative project. But there are a lot of things that are completely consistent from president to president.
Yeah, that was my larger point, that generally U.S. foreign policy is not really that different. And so, in an election year here in the United States, people sometimes worry about foreign, what we're going to do here and there. And I always tell people, like, it's not going to be that different. Either candidate could win. It's not going to be demonstrably different. I mean, there might be some differences with certain kinds of nation states, but overall it will be more or less the same. Let me ask one of the two final bits here, I guess, is China. China, you talk about in the book as well, is kind of a frenemy of sorts. It's a threat in some ways, but it's not in other ways. Dueling economies. What is the biggest threat you think China has to the U.S.? Where does Taiwan's policy fit in here? My understanding with Taiwan is that the Taiwan policy has been the same virtually. There's some changes since the Truman administration, which is pretty wild. So that story is very interesting. Well, but what do we think about China and the U.S. and how their relations kind of evolve, going further into the 21st century based on what it's been?
Well, I know the argument that Chomsky would make, which is that essentially China is not a threat, that the threat that China poses is that it is a rising power in Asia, and that the United States does not like to accept challenges to its power. And so the reason that U.S.-China tensions are growing is because China is becoming more powerful, not because China is actually threatening the United States, not because there's any real risk that the Chinese are going to invade America or what have you. Taiwan, as you mentioned, there's been a consistent policy for years, which is that the one China policy is that both Taiwan and, you got to state it very precisely because it's very delicately worded. Both Taiwan and China agree that there is one China and that Taiwan is part of China. And that's because it used to be the case that the Taiwanese government essentially saw itself as a government in exile from mainland China and believed that they were the legitimate government of all of China, right? So the way that the China-Taiwan conflict is usually portrayed in the United States is as big China trying to swallow up a little democracy on an island outside its territory. But in fact, the Taiwan-China conflict is very complicated because it was the Chinese government that retreated to Taiwan and were planning to reinvade the mainland. And both Taiwan and China agree that China and Taiwan are one entity, but they disagreed over who should be the legitimate government of that one entity. And so what the policy, which has been a good policy for many years, has to say, okay, well, we recognize that there's a dispute here, and we're going to be very careful about taking sides here, because we don't want to do anything that is going to make the Chinese government more likely to try and invade and conquer and annex by force Taiwan. And so for many years, that policy has worked pretty well, because China has not attempted to forcibly reintegrate Taiwan. And the argument that is expanded on a bit in the book is that in recent years, the United States has taken some provocative actions that make it more likely that China will itself respond in ways that are menacing and threatening, not towards the United States, but towards Taiwan.
Yeah. So last I guess issue here is, there's some threats in the world. Obviously climate change is still a big threat, although I do feel that China and India's lack of really big sweeping reforms is a big issue here. U.S. as well, but U.S. does its part, could do it a better job, but other countries need to do a better job as well. But then there's also the threat of nuclear war, which, we haven't really talked about as much, but it has become, with all of the various conflicts in the world, especially with Russia-Ukraine conflict, a little bit more in conversation. And of course, Iran is always in the mix as well. How much do we think nuclear, maybe not war, but nuclear threat is more salient now than it was maybe in the 70s or 80s? Is it become a little bit more of a relevant topic or issue, or not so much of a threat?
No, I mean, the argument that we make in the book is that actually nuclear war is a vastly underappreciated threat. I mean, there is a sort of ongoing arms race that is not really talked about. There is the modernization of nuclear weapons is taking place in the United States and in China and in Russia. And that's coinciding with the increase in tension between these countries. And we've seen in the war in Ukraine, Putin has several times floated the possibility of resorting to nuclear weapons. It seems unlikely that he will use them in the way things currently stand. But if, for instance, Ukraine were to make significant advances beyond a certain point, it is conceivable that Putin would resort to nuclear weapons. At which point, the question would be, what is the U.S. response going to be? And we know that the ladder of nuclear escalation can be ascended very, very quickly. And we also know that we have gotten to the point, we discuss in the book, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we know that within living memory, we got to the point where we're on the brink of the United States and the Soviet Union launching an all-out nuclear war that would have fundamentally destroyed humanity. That happened. That happened within living memory. It can happen again. Just because the Cold War is not over, there are people who say we're in a new Cold War already. Well, that may or may not be the accurate label for what we're in, but it is certainly the case that when two countries are both nuclear armed, each unwilling to back down on certain positions, and less and less able to talk to each other and see each other as enemies or existential threats, you can get very quickly close to the point where nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons, is being seriously considered. Yeah. And that's absolutely terrifying, right? It's a real threat. It could, within 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, unless we manage to eliminate nuclear weapons, it's fairly likely that there will come some point at which they are used, and at that point all bets are. I mean, we've used them before. We are the only country that has ever used them against another population. Could we do so again? I don't see a reason why not. The nuclear taboo is very strong, but it's not unbreakable.
Yeah, I agree. Well, last question here. What is the likelihood that there are some changes or movements with U.S. foreign policy as we go into the 21st century? And And how do we continue to dispel the myth of this kind of American exceptionalism and idealism?
Well, I mean, the hope is in popular movements, right? Because the Vietnam War ended in part because the American people, their tolerance for it diminished. The American people do have elections. They do have some level of control over their government's actions. And so it's incumbent upon us to see what is being done, to understand when our government does things that are unconscionable, and to then put popular pressure on the government to change policies. And that happens. I mean, Chomsky argues that one reason why the United States didn't, in the 1980s in Central America, launch an all-out U.S. invasion the way we did in Vietnam, sending American soldiers there. The reason why we could find ourselves to covert support for Central American groups is that the Reagan administration understood that the American people wouldn't stand for it because they remembered Vietnam. And so we can affect policy. We didn't succeed in preventing the Bush administration from invading Iraq, but we may succeed in preventing a similar invasion of Iran. We may succeed in, the nuclear disarmament movement. Actually, we documented in the book some striking successes that the anti-nuclear movement had in getting arms control put into place that wouldn't have occurred were it not for a popular movement. And so I think, the challenge is to understand the things that you don't see, to learn to notice things that are not discussed or won't appear in the press, and then to try and build a political movement to exert pressure. But I think it can be done. I actually think we can live in a much more humane and just world, and I think the book ends on a fairly hopeful note.
It certainly does, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying there. I think it's very, very important. Nathan, this was so much fun. I appreciate your time, your energy, your brilliance. It's a fantastic book. I love the conversation tremendously, and I'm very, very grateful for you coming on and talking all about it.
Thank you. It's a great honor to come on. Thank you for all of these thoughtful questions. I enjoyed our conversation as well. Really nice to meet you. Nice talking to you.
Absolutely.